There we go.
Well, hi everyone. I am so glad that you're hanging in here tonight. And now that you've learned about the admissions process, now we get to talk about financial aid. And it's one of those things that we just all have to kind of get through. But I promise you, there's lots of help and resources, and it's usually a lot easier to navigate. And I think it especially will be going forward than it has in the past. So I'm Mila Tappan. I work for the Finance Authority of Maine. So I have known all of you at Old Town High School, the counselors, for a long time, and that's great. I used to work at UMaine, and then I've been at FAME for about 15 years now. But probably most importantly, I've had my own kids go through this process, so I do understand as a parent it's a little bit nerve-wracking. So we're here at FAME to make sure we can do whatever we can to make this process as easy as possible. And again, you do have Meredith Lee, who is absolutely wonderful, to help you as well. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk a little bit about just how financial aid works, the steps to receive financial aid. We're going to talk a little bit about the types of aid, and we're going to talk about the financial aid offer and things we'd like you to know about that, and resources that we have, and other tools. And then we're going to talk a little bit about FSA IDs at the end. So for those of you who are alumni, the first couple of slides, they're going to be like, okay, nothing's changed. So bear with me, and I will mention when I get there what's changed and different from the past. For those of you who've never done this, I know none of this is different. You're just doing it the way that it is for the first time. So I'll try to keep both audiences in mind tonight. Do feel free to jump in with any questions that you have. Just put them in the chat, and if I see them, I will stop periodically and check out the questions and answer them. All right, so financial aid. So financial aid is available to make sure that students can pay for higher education. We all know that school has gotten more expensive, and without financial aid, most kiddos, including mine, would not have been able to afford to pursue higher education. When we talk about financial aid, we have two broad categories of aid that we think about. The first is merit-based aid, and this was something that your counselors talked about tonight. So merit-based aid is the aid that the admissions office, for example, might offer. So at the University of Maine, if you get your admissions application in by December 1st, you'll be considered for the merit aid they have, and that's aid based on who the student is and what they bring to the table. So one of the most common types of merit-based aid, of course, is money based on a student's GPA or performance in high school. Another type of merit aid might be athletic money. There's not as much of it as people think, but there is some. An individual department at a school might have their own money. They're looking for certain attributes in particular students, and so they may make some money available as well. The key to merit money is it's based on the student specifically and has nothing to do with the family's financial situation. Need-based aid is the type of aid that is based on the family's financial situation. And that's what we're going to focus on tonight. But I wanted to start by mentioning merit-based aid only because it's really important that you talk with any of the schools that your students are applying to find out, do they have merit aid and what is the process for receiving it? So for example, at UMaine, you have to get your admissions deadline in by a certain point, or what are the next steps? So that's a really important thing, to be sure that you're having those conversations with all of the schools. But need-based aid is based on families filing the FAFSA. And so the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid, and it's what all schools use to determine eligibility for federal financial aid. And in Maine, we also use it to determine eligibility for all of the Maine state grant. Additionally, most schools here in Maine also use the FAFSA to determine eligibility for their own institutional money. The only exceptions are Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby here in Maine, and we'll talk about how they do their stuff in a moment. So we want to be sure absolutely everyone fills out the FAFSA, even if you don't think that you would qualify. You don't know if you will qualify, and I will tell you that eligibility has been increased. So more people are going to be eligible for the Pell Grant and some of the other funds than in the past. But additionally, many scholarship organizations are now requiring that students file the FAFSA, even to be considered for these outside scholarships. And the reason for that is they want to be sure that students are maximizing all of the aid that might be out there. Anyone who's thinking about going to community college, the way you access free community college or free tuition is by filling out the FAFSA. And if people are going to have to borrow any money at all, obviously if you can get by without borrowing, that's fabulous, or limit your borrowing, that's a really good thing. But if you're going to need to borrow at all, federal student loans are the best loans out there. And later tonight, we'll touch very briefly on federal student loans and what makes them different. So hopefully all of you who are here because you are going to file the FAFSA. And so let's get on and talk about some other things that we also want to be sure you're aware of before we get down to the specifics of the FAFSA. So researching schools is really important. You want to be sure that your student has a list of schools that they are going to apply to. Sometimes students say, you know what, I'm going to go to UMaine or I'm going to go to a community college and that's it. And that's kind of a different scenario. What I don't want students to do ideally is to say, hey, I'm going to apply to these 3 private schools out of state. And I realized that, oh my goodness, none of those schools have really good financial aid. So researching schools and having a good list of schools is super important. When you're looking at schools, one of the things I would encourage you not to be turned off by, it's hard not to be, is the sticker price. So sometimes you might see that some schools out there, we're pushing over $80,000 at some schools now. Actually, don't let that deter you initially, because what really matters is the net price, not the sticker price. And the net price is the amount that the school is going to cost you. So the net price is the cost of schools after grants and scholarships. And here's the thing, some of the schools that are the most expensive schools out there have really great grants and scholarships. So I have seen scenarios where some of those really expensive schools are actually more affordable even than some of our state schools. So, again, don't be deterred by sticker price initially. I definitely care about cost and affordability, but you want to just research schools and use something called their net price calculator to get a sense of how much an individual school is going to cost you. A net price calculator, what the school does is they take your specific information, they use their specific information, and they provide an estimate. So all schools are required to have this calculator available on their website. So I'd love to have you check that out. Another thing too, as you're researching schools, is this concept of percent of need met. If a school meets all of your need, that's wonderful, right? If every school met all of your need, cost wouldn't be as much of an issue. But some schools do a better job of meeting your need than other schools do. There's a really cool feature, and if you're interested in going into more detail about it, you can always reach out to me and I can share more. But the College Board's Big Future site, so the College Board we talked about tonight already, they're the SAT people, the AP people. Well, they have a really great college search tool. And what it does is it takes about 4,000 schools are in their database, and based on what's important to you and your student, it's going to filter them down and narrow them down to a more manageable number. Well, one way that you can search on schools is by affordability. So schools that meet the highest percent of need. So that's a tool that I'd love to have you check out as you and your student are chatting and figuring out how to build that list of schools. Deadlines are super important, as are knowing what forms need to be completed. Sometimes if schools don't have enough aid, every school wishes they had more, but if a school doesn't have quite enough aid, what they do is they say, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to have a priority filing deadline, and everybody who meets that deadline, we're going to consider for all of the types of aid that we have available. People who miss that deadline can still potentially be considered for aid, but they're going to get what's left. So knowing what a school's priority deadline is super important to make sure that your student meets that deadline, because they do vary by school. So for example, the University of Maine, again, having worked there, and I know it's right in your backyard, they have a March 1st priority filing deadline. So you want to be sure, and that's very common, especially for the University of Maine schools. That's a very common deadline. So you want to know what the priority deadlines are at all of the schools on your students list and make sure the FAFSA gets filed by that earliest date. Now, when it comes to financial aid applications, I said a moment ago that all schools require the FAFSA because all schools have to use the FAFSA to determine eligibility for federal financial aid and for the Maine State Grant here in Maine. Many of the schools, except for Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby, use it to determine eligibility for their own institutional money as well. But there are some schools that require this additional form called the CSS profile. And they will use that to determine eligibility for their own money. So at Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby, for example, the student will fill out the FAFSA. They'll use that to determine eligibility for federal and state money. But when it comes to their own money, they're going to use the CSS profile information. And it is a longer application. But schools that require it, they do it because they've got a lot of money to spend. So even though it's a supplemental or additional application, if a school requires it, that's a good indication that they have a lot of financial aid available, or else they wouldn't bother to do that. So again, in Maine, only those 3 schools, but if you start looking at schools, say in the Boston area, a lot of those schools do require the CSS profile. So what I'd love to have people do is your student has their list, you want to look up every school, go to their financial aid page, check out if they have a priority deadline. If they do, write it down. Find out, are they a FAFSA only school? If they are, just indicate that. But if they are a CSS profile school, make a note of that and see if the CSS profile has the same or different deadline. Okay, so that's all stuff you can be doing. We do have a publication called Pay. I kind of just breezed by it at the beginning. But in our publication Pay, which I believe there are plenty of it at the high school, and if there aren't, we'll order more and get you more. There is a tracker in there, so you can use that if you'd like to keep track of, FAFSA deadlines, other requirements, and even admissions deadlines if you'd like to do that. Okay, so that's kind of some background information, and I didn't go into as much detail because I really do want to focus tonight on some things that have changed related to the FAFSA, knowing that I have people who have done it before, but also just being sure that all of you feel comfortable about what the steps are that are required to be ready to file the FAFSA. It is delayed this year until December. I'm going to say that a couple times, but there are things we really need people to be doing ahead of time. The FAFSA should be easier to complete this year. There are fewer questions, but there are some things that need to be done ahead of time where they in the past could have been done when you were ready to file the FAFSA. And those things are specifically related to the FSA ID. So the FSA ID is a federal student aid ID. So federal student aid is who administer all of the federal, student aid programs, all of the loans and all of that. To get into any of the federal student aid websites, you've got to create an FSA ID. So to create an FSA ID, you simply go to studentaid.gov and you set up an account. And it takes about 10 minutes. It's really not difficult to do at all. In the process of setting up your account, you're going to create a username and a password. And what's absolutely critical is to make sure that you write down the username and password because you will need them for years to come. Because filing the FAFSA is not a one-time deal. You're going to do it every single year. But additionally, if your students borrow any federal student loans, that's how they'll get into the federal website to be able to see that. So for example, my oldest son, I can't believe it was 28, and he graduated from college in 2017. And so now his loans have been on pause because he then went to grad school. But then his loans have been on pause, but now he has to go into repayment. How he gets his information is by logging into federalstudentaid.gov or studentaid.gov, excuse me, and that's how he can see all of his loans. So that FSA ID that we created all of those years ago, he still needs that now. So it's really important that people have a way of keeping track of these passwords because what's different about the FSA ID from other types of passwords that we all have is your FSA ID is tied to your social security number. So you can only have one. So I don't know about you, but I have multiple Apple IDs. I set up an Apple ID account and I got it all messed up and I couldn't access it. So I have more than one email address. So I simply created a second Apple ID account. And I could do that with my Apple ID. I cannot do that with my FSA ID. Everyone can only have one. Once it's created, you need to either know what the password and usernames are, or you need to unravel them. You can't just create a new one. So what we've created is a worksheet. So you see a sample here of our student worksheet, and we also have one for parents. They are available on our website. So we would love to have you print those off or save them electronically and fill in the information so that you can, keep track of this information. I have a little book. So whatever works for you, but the important thing is just to make sure it gets noted somewhere. Sometimes people write it down and take a picture. whatever works for you. So who needs an FSA ID? So every single student needs an FSA ID. So I know that it was mentioned that those will be created in class. So that's great. That's one thing that you won't need to worry about. But yes, all students need to go to studentaid.gov and create their own FSA ID. Now, if the students are dependent students, meaning that they're going to have to provide parent information on the FAFSA, and that is the case with most high school students, then they will have to figure out who is considered a contributor on their FAFSA. That's a new term. So even those of you who have done FAFSAs before, you're like, contributor, I've never heard that term. A contributor is a new term, and it refers to anyone on the FAFSA who is having to provide consent and approval. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a moment. So those individuals will also need to create an FSA ID. So before I go into detail about that, let me just say that whenever you're creating an FSA ID, you will need to have an email, a unique email, and you will need to have access to it so that you can verify it. And how a lot of things are requiring two-step verification now, so that you use it and then they send you a code and you have to put the code in. That's how it works with your email. So new this year, everybody has to have a unique email account associated with their FSA ID. So for parents out there who maybe, both parents are going to get an FSA ID, but you share an email account, you'll have to create another one because it has to be a unique email address when you're creating your FSA ID, and the same with your phone number. It has to be unique, only one in the system. Now with students, one of the things, and they'll probably take care of making sure of this when your students create this at school, but we don't want students to use their high school email address. And the reason is because that's going to go away. When they graduate next year, sooner or later, they will lose access to that account. And we want them to have an email associated with their FSA ID that they're going to have access to indefinitely. So if your kiddos haven't yet, now's a great time to set up a Gmail account or something like that they will have, and they will have it through the rest of high school. They'll have it through college, they'll have it afterwards, and they'll maintain access to that. So that's an important thing to be doing if you haven't already done that or your kids haven't done that yet. FSA IDs do need to now be authenticated by the Social Security Administration before they can be used. It used to be that people could set up an FSA ID. They could create their account and use their FSA ID that night to file a FAFSA. That is no longer going to be the case. So what we need families to do, and this is probably one of the biggest takeaways from tonight, is that I want to be sure that all the students, sounds like you're in good shape at Old Town, and all of the parents who are contributors, make sure that you get your FSA ID set up at least a week before you're planning to do the FAFSA, to leave time for that information to be authenticated by the Social Security Administration. Takes about 3 days usually, but we're saying a week just to be on the safe side.
So Mila, that would be super important, like for those people who want to make thinking ahead if they want to make an appointment with like Meredith or
Yes.
you, that going into those meetings that 1 week. So I'm glad. Thank you for saying that. So
yeah, that's a really, really good point. I'm glad you brought that up because yes, if you are going to meet with Meredith, which again, I highly recommend, that's one of those things you're going to want to be sure that you do that ahead of time, because if you meet with her and you haven't done any of that, then what that means is what the two of you are going to be able to do that first meeting is just set up your FSA IDs. And then you're going to have to stop. You're going to wait to have them authenticated. So it's really important to get those done ahead of time. A big, probably the most significant change from in the past. But another change, slight change from in the past, relates to who parent contributors are. So what a contributor, again, is someone who has to provide consent and approval on the FAFSA. And you're like, what is consent and approval? Well, one of the things that's making the FAFSA so much easier to do than it has been in the past is there is a direct data exchange now between the IRS and the Department of Education. So for the last, I'm going to say 8 years, what's been going on is a parent could go in or a student could go in, they could request their tax information from the IRS, they could transfer it back into the FAFSA and give Department of Ed permission to use it. Anyone who's ever done that, and I recognize a few names on the screen tonight, I know that that's been problematic sometimes. It just doesn't always work. So what they've done now is there's just a direct exchange. So literally, they're just going to use social security numbers. We won't even see the data, but behind the scenes, what's going to happen is they're just going to pull tax information and send it to the Department of Education. Okay. Won't even show up on the FAFSA, but it will be connected with the FAFSA so that eligibility can be calculated. Well, guess what? The IRS can't just share your information with the Department of Education. They can only do it if you give them permission to. So that's what consent and approval is. It's your consent and the approval of your consent for the IRS to share your information with the Department of Education. And then part 2 of that is for the Department of Education to then share that information with the college. So that's what consent and approval is. Now, I'm going to talk more about that in a moment, but it's one of those changes that it's going to apply to everybody. So let me say that. I'll more in a moment on that one. I want to check real quick. Let me just see, because I might be answering it. Okay. That's a good question, and I will answer that momentarily. Okay, so here's who are parent contributors. So this is who needs to have an FSA ID. So if you are a parent contributor, that means you have to provide consent and approval. And the way you provide consent and approval is by using your FSA ID. So if you're a situation where you're a couple and you're married to each other, then the second question will become, did you file your taxes jointly? So for example, my husband and I are married. So when the kids do their FAFSA, only one of us still needs to have an FSA ID. So I would be, or my husband, we only need one parent contributor. And that's because we're married and we file a joint tax return. So because we file a joint tax return, I can grant consent on behalf of my husband, or he could grant consent on behalf of me. Okay. So for parents who are married, file a joint tax return, same as it's always been, one parent needs an FSA ID. But here's a tweak. If parents are married and file separate tax returns, which sometimes happens, or if parents live together but aren't married, then both parents are considered contributors and both parents will need an FSA ID. Okay. So even though they're married, the issue is that if I file taxes separately from my husband, I can't consent for his tax information to be released, and he can't consent for mine. So we both would have to provide consent and approval, and in order to do that, we both need an FSA ID. Now, what about those situations where parents are divorced, separated, or never married, and so the student's biological or adopted parents live in different households? Little tweak to this one too. In the past, it was who did the student live with most the last 12 months. And now it is which parent provided the most financial support over the last 12 months. Whichever parent provided the most financial support, that's going to be the parent who is going to complete the FAFSA. That parent will be considered a contributor and will need an FSA ID. So I've gotten some questions because this is new, and as we start talking more about this, people are saying, well, how do you figure out who provides the most financial support? I would say oftentimes it's probably still going to be the parent that the student lives with most, right? Because when you think about housing and food and electric bills and water bills and clothing and all of that, it's likely going to be that parent still, but not necessarily. So, we have to look at child support. If someone is receiving child support, that has to be taken into account. And so you want to think about all of those things. I think another big determining factor is health insurance. Who provides the health insurance? So for families that are in that situation where biological or adoptive parents are divorced or separated or never married and they don't live in the same household, then just start thinking now about which parent has provided the most financial support over the last 12 months. Schools, unless they have conflicting information, are not going to ask you to prove it. But you do want to be sure that you think through this and determine which parent was the parent that provided the most financial support. That parent, again, is a contributor that will need an FSA ID. And then the last piece on this one is that parent remarried as of today or married as of today? So let's just say that biological parents got divorced years ago. Student has, mom is providing the most financial support. Mom is currently married. She remarried. Then her spouse would also have their information on the FAFSA. Now, whether or not their spouse needs to have their own FSA ID comes down to what? Guess what? did they file a joint tax return in 2022? Because that's the year of taxes that we're looking at for the FAFSA that we're going to be doing for the 24-25 year that's going to come out in December. Okay, so it's 2 questions. What's the marital status? And once you've determined that, then what's the tax filing status? So if parents are remarried, and let's just say they just got remarried, or just got married, and so they filed, we think back to 2022, and they filed separate tax returns, then the spouse will also need their own FSA ID because they are a contributor who will have to provide consent and approval, right? So I'm going to answer the question in the chat in just a moment. But I want you to be thinking about whether you have any questions related to any of this. Because again, this is the part that's different and new. And so we know that there's some new terms, and it's taking us a bit to get our heads around it as well. But I did have that question in the chat about whether or not someone who has an FSA ID already needs to do anything specific. So if you have an FSA ID already, like I have one already, there is nothing that you need to do in terms of you're going to use that same FSA ID. So again, we don't create new ones. You've already got one. The only thing I would say to parents who already have an FSA ID is it's a great idea sometime this fall to go to studentaid.gov and log in and make sure that your FSA ID is working. So make sure you know your username and password. There are some parents out there who don't have an email address attached to their FSA ID. So it was possible last year and some of the years to create an FSA ID without providing an email address. You had to provide either an email address or a cell phone number. But now it's not an or, it's a you have to provide an email address. So for people who might have only provided a cell phone number originally, they do need to add an email address to their account and have that verified by getting that code and putting that into the system. So if you're not sure if you ever provided an email address, then you want to go in and do that because you will have to do that before you'll be able to use your FSA ID this year. Okay, so if there are any questions related to that, please let me know.
Mila, is there like a limit, like a 10-year, 5-year, like if you created an FSA ID, like, 10 years ago, I wasn't sure about that.
Yeah, no, there's not. So what we have seen, I went back the other day and I looked at when did FSA IDs first start, because I'm thinking how, I know it's been quite a while. May of 2015 is when they were first created. And so, yeah, no, I don't anticipate that they will ever, go away. At least, I mean, they'll go away, I guess, eventually technology will change, but they're here to stay. And so if you've created one, you're just going to use that one. The only thing that I have seen is that periodically I have to reset my password. So I think that's what some families or individuals might experience if they haven't used it for a bit. They might have to reset their password before they can use it. But that's an easy thing. They can do that. It only takes a minute or two. Okay. Let's see. Anything else? What if you can't remember your ID because you completed one for older kids 10 plus years ago? So you wouldn't have, so when people are wondering whether they have an FSA ID, one of the things you want to think about is the fact that FSA IDs became a thing in May of 2015. So if you had kids in that finished up school before that, you didn't. You had a PIN. You had a 4-digit PIN. If your kids started school, more recently, and you would have had one going through the financial aid process since May of 2015, then what you're going to do is you're going to go to studentaid.gov and you're going to click on login. And when you go to click on login, it's going to ask you your username and password. And if you don't know what they are, there are ways that you can retrieve them. And so if you can, you can indicate that you want to retrieve it. It will ask you, your cell phone number or your email address, and they'll send a code and do all of that. So if you can do that, if you've used it, recently enough and your email address is still working, which is why we don't want kids using their high school one, then usually retrieving it and resetting passwords is pretty straightforward. If that's not simple, if you run into issues, you don't know what the email was, you don't know what the phone number was, that's when you call us. You call us anytime. I mean, that's what we help people with a lot this time of year and into the winter when the FAFSA comes out, is problem solving and trying to deal with those FSA IDs. So, we've had a lot of experience with it, and learned some tricks. So we are more than happy to help you if you have an issue with that. So just reach out to us at FAME, and my contact information will be at the end. Okay. All right, so let's continue on. And I'm going to let you know when I've covered everything that's different, so that those of you who are good with the rest of the process know you can sign off if you want to. Not that I wouldn't love to have you stay with me for the whole night. So when the FAFSA becomes available, you're going to complete the 24-25 FAFSA. So high school seniors right now will be doing the 24-25 FAFSA as their first FAFSA, because that's the FAFSA that's going to cover their first year in college. It seems crazy, doesn't it? That your seniors are graduating in the spring of 24. When they start college, it'll be September of 24. And so it's the 24-25 FAFSA they're going to complete. They're going to go to studentaid.gov, the same place that they would go to create an FSA ID. So if you look over to the right of this here, you're going to see log in and create account. So that's where you go to create your account. But you're also going to see that when the time comes, you're going to be able to come right back to studentaid.gov, and thankfully, they've put the FAFSA right there, nice and prominent on the dashboard. It was not always the case. So it makes it easy to get to the FAFSA. Now, the FAFSA is free application for federal student aid. So don't pay anyone to submit it for you. If you need help, there's Meredith, there's us at FAME. There's lots of people who will provide help and assistance, and we all do it for free. So never pay anyone. Now, normally the FAFSA would be available on October 1st. That has been for the last, 8 years when the FAFSA has become available. But this year, because they've done such a massive overhaul of the system, I mean, they basically rebuilt it from scratch. It is delayed until December. We don't know the date yet. I was on a call today. Still no word as to what the specific date is, but sometime in December. Next year, it will go back to October 1st. So this being December is just a one-year blip, just because they need a little bit more time to get this all done. And when you hear that there's potentially going to be a government shutdown, our understanding is the contractors can still be working on this and making progress. So that came up today as well. So that's what you're going to be looking for, is the FAFSA to become available in December. Now, we are going to want people to get their FAFSA done as soon as possible, reasonably, because we want to be sure that you meet those deadlines. That said, I'm going to sound like I'm contradicting myself. I would not do the FAFSA the first day or two it becomes available. I think that there's going to be a lot of people in the system. It's brand new, and there'll probably be, a few bugs here and there. So we're just going to have to be patient. So I would say give it a couple days. Don't wait too long. Give it a couple of days, and then go ahead and do the FAFSA. Of course, for many people, depending on where the students go, and you can wait, a little bit longer. But I do want to be sure that people get it done. So if they have any issues or questions, we have time to get those resolved. Now, as mentioned, the 24-25 FAFSA requires 2022 tax information. Again, we're not really going to have to enter really any, there's one or two small pieces of information related to income that we will have to provide. The vast majority of it's going to come over from the IRS. So that is why that consent and approval is absolutely critical. So all contributors are going to have to provide that consent and approval. If you do not provide consent and approval, the student is ineligible for federal student aid. So consent and approval is required even of people who don't file taxes. So we've got people who are not required to file taxes. Even they have to provide consent and approval. Let's just say you or a family, for whatever reason, filed a foreign tax return. You still have to provide consent and approval. Everybody has to provide consent and approval. And without that, the student isn't eligible for federal student aid. And the student will provide consent, and the parent or the contributor, other parent contributor, will provide consent. All right, so when you're filling out the FAFSA, you're going to find it's going to be easier than it's ever been. I mean, I know not many of you have never done it, but you're going to find that there are fewer questions. More information is being pulled from other places. One thing that's a little bit different for people who have done it previously, I don't normally mention this, but I know I have people who have done it before, is that the FAFSA is going to be roles-based now, which means that students are going to sign in and only see student questions. Parents are going to sign in and only see parent questions. So instead of being one application that you move through student and then parent stuff, they're actually going to be segmented, and each parent, each person, the student will log into their section with their FSA ID. the parent contributor will log into the parent section with their FSA ID, and then whoever starts it will invite the other. Okay. Certainly, if you have questions about that, let me know. We'll be doing additional sessions as the time for the FAFSA becomes closer, but again, we're not available until December. Asset information, I just want to touch briefly on asset information because that's the other question that parents often will have is what asset information is required on the FAFSA. There's some really good news out there about this that I think will make a lot of people feel better. Many people are not going to have to provide any asset information at all. So if you are someone who receives any federally means tested benefits, you will not have to provide any asset information, period. If you receive TANF, WIC, Social Security benefits, an earned income tax credit, subsidized housing, any of those things, you will not have to provide any assets. And because I might be able to shortcut the answer, Kim, does Old Town, provide free and reduced lunch to everybody?
Correct. Yeah, this year they do as they do. Anybody who has like handed in that form. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So here's the thing, everybody, and I think this will not last. So take advantage of it. Anyone who receives free and reduced lunch is not going to have to provide any asset information. Anyone. Do you know we have 7 states where everyone's eligible for free and reduced lunch? So in those 7 states, no one is going to have to provide assets. So everyone who's at a school that provides free and reduced lunch to everybody, as long as the student participates and gets that, occasionally eats that free and reduced lunch, you will not have to provide assets on the FAFSA because you will be able to check that box that and that someone in your household received free and reduced lunch. Okay. So that's major. That's massive.
Like I said, they it was eligible for everybody, but I know that it was part of like kind of that back to school paperwork that they needed to fill out a form just even, to kind of check off that box.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So the other thing is that let's just say that someone's not receiving any of those benefits. Anyone who makes less than $60,000 per year usually will not have to provide any asset information at all. It does depend on the schedule. So in some cases, when you file taxes, you file some additional schedules. And so sometimes if people file certain schedules, then they do still have to provide asset information. But the vast majority of people that make under 60,000 are not going to have to provide any asset information. So this is a long-winded way of saying that, the FAFSA is income driven. It is not asset driven. So assets have very little impact because many people don't have to provide assets. And even if you do have to provide assets, they have very little impact on financial aid eligibility. When you provide assets, if you are one of the handful that do have to provide it, you're going to exclude your primary residence and you're going to exclude your retirement account. So the value of your primary residence and your retirement accounts are completely excluded from the FAFSA. So even if you do provide assets, you do not count those. They are required on the CSS profile though. All other things, are going to count now. So we're talking about any other second properties, any businesses. If you had a family farm, you would exclude the residence, but the rest of the family farm would count. Cash, savings, checking, any sorts of additional investments. If you have college savings plans, you would list those, but only the amount for the kiddo that's going to college, the kiddo on that particular application. That's a slight tweak from in the past. So if anyone has more questions about assets, but hopefully most of you build out that form or can make that happen so that your kid is getting free and reduced lunch, and then you don't have to worry about these questions, these asset questions at all. All right. I have talked about the things that are different. So from this point forward, with the exception of, and I'll mention it now just in case some of you who have done it before need to go, you'll notice that, well, you won't notice because the question's still there. On the FAFSA, there is still a question that asks if you have more than one child in college. It will ask how many kids you have in college. That is not going to factor into financial aid eligibility anymore. But the reason I want to mention it right now, in case it's applicable to parents who were used to having that what was the EFC, that's now going to be called the SAI. the student aid index divided in half, you can do an appeal. You can talk to the school about that. So I'm going to touch on that in just a moment. But for those of you who already are familiar with the rest of the process, that's the only thing that I have left that's different from last year. So if you are ready to head out, I understand that. For any of the rest of you, I'm going to zip through the rest of what we have to talk about tonight, because I do want you to know what happens after the FAFSA gets filed. As much as that's our focus, we want to be sure that you feel comfortable with the afterwards. So after the FAFSA is submitted, what you're going to find happens is it's going to get processed, and that information is going to get sent to every school that the student listed on their FAFSA. The student will get an email, or they can just simply log back into studentaid.gov, and they can take a look at what's called their FAFSA submission summary. This is going to have all of the information that they provided on the FAFSA. It won't show any federal tax information, but it's going to show all of the rest of the information, and they can just make sure everything looks okay. And, if not, they will know that they need to follow up. A lot of times, scholarship people want a copy of this. Again, the old student aid report, now being referred to the FAFSA submission summary, the FSS, because it does give there's a number, that SAI, that student aid index. Some scholarship organizations will use that as they're determining who they're going to give their scholarships to. So it's a good idea for students to check out that FAFSA submission summary, save it to your desktop, make sure that's available so that they can provide it to someone if need be. Now, eventually you'll get financial aid offers, and we're going to talk about those in a moment, but the school will put together a financial aid offer, and they won't do this until your student has been offered admission. So once your student has been offered admission, the school has received the financial aid, the FAFSA data, then they will, and anything else they might need, they're going to put together a financial aid offer. And the types of aid that might be included could be grants and scholarships. Grants and scholarships are the best of all types of financial aid because they don't have to be repaid. Scholarships are usually merit-based. Grants are usually need-based. That's not 100%, but usually that's the way that it works. Scholarships and grants come from all sorts of sources: the federal government, the state. Maine has a Maine state grant. The deadline for that is just making sure your senior gets their FAFSA done by May 1st of their senior year. So you've still got months to get it done once it becomes available. Institutional aid from the school itself, and then private scholarships. There's also a program called Work Study. I love Work Study. It's a fabulous program. It's a program where a school might say to a student, here, you have a $2,000 work study offer or some differing amount. And then what the student does is they get a job and they work typically on campus, and they earn that money over a course, the course of a semester or a year. Their amount of pay depends on their job, and they just get a biweekly paycheck. It feels just like a regular job. But what's great about Work Study is it's a lot easier to find a job on campus if you have Work Study, because the employer, the individual office on campus only has to pay a portion of your wages, because most of your wages are paid through the federal government. The big caveat I have about Work Study that I just wanted to share is that when schools send out their financial aid offer, some of them are very clear how Work Study works, that it's different. But some of them are not. So when you see that Work Study offer, just make sure that you keep in mind that that money is not available until your student earns that money, which means it's not going to be available to pay that bill that's going to be due in August before they start school. Okay, so some financial aid offers make that nice and clear, others don't. But I've had too many parents, throughout the years, think that Work Study money is going to be available up front, and it's not. So just make sure that you're aware of it. It's great for, laundry money, for gas money, home, maybe for books for the next semester if students are really good about saving their money, but it does not help get that first bill paid. And then you're going to find that probably on virtually all of your students' financial aid offers, they're going to have a federal student loan. Federal student loans are different than any other types of loans out there. A federal student loan is your student is eligible for one simply because they did the FAFSA and because they're a college student. They are not co-signed loans, so you as a parent are not co-signing a student loan. It's only in the student's name, and it is not credit-based. So your student is able to get it on their own. However, it is limited to $5,500 per year because, again, people are getting these loans and with no credit check or anything like that. So federal student loans are limited. So the maximum amount for a first year student is $5,500. So like I said, I think most of your students are going to find that each one of their financial aid offers is going to include a $5,500 federal student loan. Okay. So the financial aid office will send you the financial aid offer either via a paper letter or an email notification. Again, the student has to be accepted for admission. Schools will not start sending notifications till at least January. I mean, they're not, the FAFSA could be as late as, the very end of December. So it's going to take schools a little bit to get the information and get those financial aid offers turned around. That's really the last couple of years, schools have been getting them out in November, December. They much prefer to do that. This year, it's going to be a little tighter, but it's that way for everybody. So what you just want to be sure of is that you have a conversation with your student about when they are offered admission, that they set up their email account with that school, which means every potential school that they are still interested in, because schools are going to want to start communicating with students via email as soon as possible. So some schools in the beginning will send paper, financial aid offers, and they'll send everything in paper, which is great because if you're the parent, you see it come in through the mail, it's on the counter, it's there. But some schools right from the get-go will send only emails, and others will transition to emails pretty quickly. And so if students aren't checking their emails, they're going to miss stuff. So you want to be sure that they are checking that. And I know my youngest son will still say to me, I hate email, Mom. I text. Why don't they text? But the reality is they don't yet, not for these sorts of things. So they want to be sure they check that email. They won't ever get a financial aid offer in their email. Instead, what will happen is they'll get an email to tell them to go to their student portal. So schools have a portal for the University of Maine system. It's called Main Street, where students can log in. They can see their class registration. They can see their bill. They can see their financial aid. They can see their past grades and all of that, stuff as time goes on. So that portal is where all that information lives. And so, oftentimes when things change, they'll get an email that will tell them to go check that out. And that's the case with financial aid offers oftentimes. When you get your financial aid offers, what we find is that all financial aid offers look a little bit different. And so it's really hard to get that apples to apples comparison just by looking at them. Some schools are a lot more expensive than others. Some schools will offer this great merit scholarship, but they're a really expensive school and it might look like it's more, but when you actually do the math, if a lower cost school with a smaller scholarship might be more affordable, how do you figure that all out? Well, we created a worksheet that can help people do that. So our worksheet just lets people, put in the direct costs. We focus on tuition fees and room and board, figure out what those costs are for school A, school B, school C, or however many there are. Subtract out the grants and scholarships. Those are the funds that don't have to be repaid. That gets you that net price that we talked about very early on. That net price at one school versus another school versus the third school is what you really want to focus on if affordability is something that you're taking into consideration. I'm not saying people should always select the least expensive school. I actually would say that's not always wise. What we want to be sure of is that students are finding schools that are a good match, that they can go there, they can be successful. But I think the reality is there does have to be some, look at affordability. Some schools are just ridiculously expensive and we don't want families borrowing all this money. So if students, before they make a decision where they're going to go, if they can do this piece and they can get a sense of what a school is going to cost them and make an informed decision, I think that really is a good way to proceed, and it prevents a lot of issues over the summer when the bills first come. They're a bit more prepared for that. When you file the FAFSA, you're going to find that the FAFSA is going to use 22 income information, as we mentioned. And what happens is sometimes we know right out of the gate that things have changed, or sometimes what we find is that things change after the FAFSA has been filed. So, maybe someone files the FAFSA, but then they lose a job, or there's a divorce or separation, or they have really high medical expenses. Or as I mentioned a moment ago, maybe they're a family that have multiple kids in college, and now the formula is no longer taking that into account, and that's making it very difficult for the family to pay for higher education and to get those bills paid. So any of those situations where there's something that's really impacting your family's financial situation, and it's not on the FAFSA, that's worth having a conversation with the financial aid office about. You know, they want to know. There's no way they're going to know what you have going on unless you go to them and tell them. And then they'll make a decision as to can they take that into account? If they take it into account, how much does it impact eligibility? You know, I really encourage people to do that, to have those conversations with the school. And if you're looking at multiple schools, so let's say it's spring and you've got 2 or 3 schools you're still looking at, be sure to have that conversation with each school, because one school might handle things a little bit differently than another school. So you need to talk with each of those schools. But I really, really encourage you to do that. And then tonight, I just really want to close by saying that there are lots of resources available on our website. We have lots of publications and handouts that are for free. We have informational videos. We have some short ones that are just focused on particular topics. We're working to get those all updated to reflect the new FAFSA. We have calculators and tools. We offer FAFSA help, so we're offering help all fall with anything related to FSA ID creation. Once the FAFSA is available, we'll switch over and actually start focusing on getting the FAFSA done. Again, you have Meredith. We have a scholarship search on our site, and we do a lot with financial wellness. Everything we do at FAME is kind of like the underpinning is, you know, we want people to be, regardless of their pathway, to make sure that financially they're in the best shape possible. We'd love to have you stay connected with us. One of the ways that you can do that is you can text us. You can text FAME to that number there, 207-707-5001, and that will get you on our texting list. We won't drive you crazy, I promise, but it will allow us to, you know, provide information to you like, hey, you know, it was just announced that the FAFSA is going to be available on this date, or some of those key pieces. And it also provides a way for you to personally ask questions if you have them. Or if emails are more your thing, you can go to famemaine.com/join and you can sign up to get our emails. You can do both, and your students can do one or both. So whatever way works for you, we'd love to be able to be connected with you so that we can share updates. You can also join our Facebook group called Paying for College for Me. We have a group of about almost 600 people now, just sharing ideas. And again, we post updates and scholarship information and stuff like that in that group. And we do offer free financial aid coaching. So, you know, you might be all set now, but down the road you have a question, or maybe you have a question now. You can go to our website and on our contact page, there's a link you can click on, and you can schedule a free session, 30-minute session with us as many times as you want. And we just do that via Zoom. And then last but not least, I'm not actually going to, you know, create them tonight unless you want to create them. I would welcome that. But I just wanted to give you a heads up that when you are ready to create your FSA ID, what you're going to need is your legal name, your date of birth, your social security number, that unique email address, a unique mobile phone number, ideally, and your mailing address. In the process of setting it up, you'll create a username and password. You'll also answer some challenge questions, verify your information with that code being sent and you putting it into the system. And we want to be sure you make a note of that information. So you guys have been a patient group, because between the counselors and we threw a lot at you tonight. So Kim, is there anything that I didn't touch on that you...
Are you kidding? You're like amazing, and you do amazing every year. So it was nice for me to sit here as a counselor, but also as a parent of 2 kids that are still in school. So I'm like absorbing this information. I will make a plug. I, as a parent, have gone on and utilized the FAME website and their resources. Amazing. Please use them as a resource. We have Meredith, but like the whole FAME crew is amazing as far as responsiveness. I use the resources in my class and with our students. So I can't say enough, and I just appreciate you being here, Mila. So please don't hesitate to reach out to FAME and to access their resources, because it's just awesome. The only other thing that I would add, just to, you know, try to release some stress as a senior parent, is even though the FAFSA is a little bit later this year, typically May 1st is considered like, sorry, I don't have my video on, I apologize. May 1st is kind of considered like decision day, like across the country for students choosing to where they're going to college and having those deposits in to say, yes, I'm going there. So that's still a really good amount of time for the FAFSA and the financial aid packages to come in and students be able to navigate and compare them. And please, please use FAME, use us as school counselors as far as like if you have questions on like comparing financial aid packages, like that we'll be happy to go over that with parents and with students for sure.
Kim, that's a great point because it's funny. Up until 8 years ago, the FAFSA never became available until January. So we lived all of our lives, with the FAFSA not coming out till January 1st. And then they did make it available earlier. And I do think it's been a good thing. But yes, we can all do this. It's still a good window, a good long window for people to get this done. And sometimes the urgency isn't the worst thing in the world, So it's just like, okay, it's available. Now we're going to do it and we're going to move on and do this step. And yeah, and there'll be lots of support. So
definitely it gives students a chance to kind of weigh their options, pro cons of schools, taking that financial piece into consideration. And I will put a plug in, like, definitely, because my husband is like, OCD, like, all right, FAFSA opens, I need to like jump on. We learned real quick, like, you know what? It's not a race. It is okay to wait a couple days because this system will get bogged down because everybody gets, oh, it's open, let's go.
Yeah.
Please don't stress out. Give yourself a couple days. Let the other people get bogged down, and you'll still get it done. If you get it done, a week or so when it opens up, that's awesome.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. So, all right then. Well, yeah. Any questions at all? I mean, people certainly can come off mute if you have a question. You just rather ask it rather than typing it in. I know we both welcome that. So
definitely. Thank you for being patient. And it's like I said, a lot of information. Don't hesitate to email Jamie or myself or Mila. Thank you, Kate. At any time if questions pop up after this. And remember, just wanted to put out there that lots of information, but we'll get it out to you in a couple files. Probably within a week, so you can go back and I can look at all the things that Mila said and to refresh myself again. So know that that's coming. So
I'm not going anywhere, and yeah. So I'll be here.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Well, good. All right. Well, I will talk to you, Kim, anytime, and call me anytime. And yeah, we're continuing to put together resources and stuff like that too. So for matter of fact, this month's Tuesday tips, which will come out next week, is all about kind of what I talked about tonight. So
awesome. Perfect. If you get a chance, jump on that FAME website, just tons of information and good stuff. But thank you very much. I appreciate your patience. Lots of information. Give us a ring, give us an email, anything you need. Okay. Thanks, Jess. All right. I'm going to stop recording.